He has a beautiful wife, Sophia, who is the embodiment of African womanhood. He has 3 beautiful, talented, and bright children. He's a scholar. He earned his master's degree from the Center for Inner City Studies of Northeastern Illinois University. And he earned a PhD from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. He is currently a professor at National Louis University, and he's a published scholar. He's published in the Journal of Pan-African Studies. He's doing research on the university, doing interviewing of those who participated in the process and also those who were in the movement in the 70s and 80s here in Chicago. He is working on that research with another former student, Dr. Richard Benson. He is currently the education chair of the Kemetic Institute. He's a community activist. He teaches martial arts. He teaches survival skills. And he also has a gentler side. He teaches philosophy to children in his spare time. These are just some of the things that Brother Dr. Kamau does. And we're so pleased to have him here with us this afternoon. Let us give him a
Mr. Melders to speak. Hotel. I want to make some slight adjustment. It's a great honor to be here today, especially given that this is a space where Dr. Brothers was so instrumental. It's an institution that he founded and an institution that has been so deeply informed by his ideas. So I want to say it's not his honor to speak today. What I want to share with you all is something that's grown out of a number of things that I've been engaged in, but specifically, specifically has grown out of this idea of thinking about how Maat informs our work of creating a better world. And so the title of this presentation is Maat, is Liberatory Praxis. Whenever we talk about any liberatory thing, we're talking about a thing that has the capacity to enable us to free ourselves. And praxis, of course, is the unity of thought and action. And I maintain that Maat illuminates ways in which we can struggle for freedom, not just attenuate our thinking about the process of gaining freedom in the world, but also how our actions can be informed by Maat. What I want to do today is move through 4 different domains of thinking about Maat, or really 4 different domains of thinking about Maat. I want to talk about time, because I think that in the Kemetic worldview, the centrality of Maat in the Kemetic cosmology, the Kemetic narratives about the creation of the universe and the centrality of Maat in that process, I think is critically important in order to understand the significance attributed to Maat in Kemetic culture. I want to talk about the crisis, what Dr. Anderson Thompson referred to as the crisis of the 21st century. I think he called it the crisis of the 20th century, but I think we can appropriately say that this is the crisis of the 21st century. And what we can think of as the dominance aspect, which creates an imperative for Maat, and then also want to deal with Maat and how we think about the nature of the human being. And then finally, I want to end with the restoration of Maat and the restoration and reclamation of the world. So I want to start this presentation off actually with a presentation that Praxis gave last year at the International Conference for the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. So it was a point that she made that I thought was really, really compelling. She talked about 3 spiritual centers in ancient Kenya. And she argued that, for the most part, Egyptologists have taken the position that these 3 spiritual centers, which existed concurrently, were in competition with each other, and that they were vying for dominance throughout the history of the society, which I thought was a very interesting idea. What she said was that, no, this wasn't the case at all. In fact, that these 3 spiritual centers coexisted with each other. And I thought this was an interesting point. Her point was a valuable one as it conveys the unity, or perhaps the unicity, of the African worldview. When we talk about the unity of a thing, we're talking about how things are bound together. For us, this often means that they have come together for a common purpose, unity. But when we talk about the unicity of a thing, we're talking about the oneness of the thing. It means that those things which appear to be separate on the surface are actually different expressions of the same reality. This principle of unicity is essential to fully apprehending the nature of African spirituality, that while there are variegated expressions of it, evidences a common set of core principles. This is important in a number of respects. Thus, what is often termed African spirituality is in fact subsumed, which means it's embedded within the African worldview. The spirituality is inextricably bound up in African cosmology, in African thoughts about the nature of the nature and origin of the universe, ethics, African beliefs or ideas about what is good behavior, processes of governance, and so forth. One notable and philosophically significant aspect of this is the African view of time. Time exists in two respects. We tend to think of time as physical, but time is also ontological, which means that when we think about a physical time in a physical sense, it's really very straightforward. You know, we are ensnared by this every day, and I say ensnared intentionally because this is part of the cultural paradigm in which we exist, where people exist as subjects of time. And so, if we think about time just as a physical phenomenon, it really pertains to measurement. The simplest way of thinking about this is that time is a way of measuring the distance from one event or one happening to the next. Oftentimes, just as a physical phenomenon, that's what time is. Again, the distance between one event and the next. We know this happened 3 minutes ago. We know that thing is going to happen 2 months from now. And so time as a physical phenomenon is just concerning to a large extent of measurement. And while that has some practicality in terms of how societies function and the way institutions function, it doesn't actually give us much insight in terms of what time actually means. What's significant about Africans, particularly the Kikongo people, as well as the people of Kemet, is that they attempted to ascribe meaning to time. They said that time isn't simply this distance between events, but that time actually means time. They suggested that there was meaning to time and that this meaning or this ordering of time told us something about time's significance. So I want to talk about two examples of this, two models of how Africans thought about time, and I want to talk about how Maat is embedded in all these ideas. And my point is that even when we talk about time and we talk about other paradigms of time from other African cultures, we're still dealing with not just a unity of thought, but a unicity of thought. So I want to talk about first the Dikenga, which is the Congo cosmogram of time. Some of you may have seen it before. It's a circle. And at each point in the circle is a smaller circle. So you have a circle at the bottom. You go up 90 degrees, 45 degrees, you have another circle. You go up another 45 degrees, you have another circle. You go 45 degrees more, you have another circle. And this is the cycle. This bottom circle represents the conception of a thing. This is the point where the idea of a thing is coming to being. Not the physical manifestation of the thing, but simply the idea of it. This next circle, this second circle, represents birth. This is the point where that thing, whatever it is, has come forth into the world. This third circle represents maturation. This is that thing once it has reached the apex of its development. And then, perhaps finally, we have the fourth circle, which represents the decline of that thing. Typically, we would associate this with death, but also transformation, and the cycle continues. The Kikongo believe that this idea that the Dikenga governs all aspects of time, we can look at this to understand anything, the cycle of an idea, the cycle of a society, the life cycle of a human being, the year, whole periods, whole epochs throughout history, that this particular paradigm of time governs everything, every aspect of reality. So this is one aspect of time. And one thing that's significant that I should point out, again, you have these four circles. You have a horizontal axis that divides the circle. And so on one end of that you have birth, on the other end of that you have death and transformation. Above that you have maturation, and below that you have conception. Well, they argue that the top half of this circle is the corporeal world, which is the world in which we live. They argue that below that, this lower half of that circle, is the spiritual world. This is the world of the ancestors, which is a very interesting idea because what it suggests is that within this lower half is the potentiality of all things. When I think about this idea of the Dikenga, and the way that I think we relate this to Maat, is that first, if we think about this journey, we see aspects of the Kemetic worldview embedded within it. If we take that first sphere, the sphere which represents conception, in many respects that represents Nehe, it represents infinity. Particularly as it relates to the fact that the bottom part of the circle represents this infinite generative capacity of this immaterial or eternal or infinite world that the people of Kemet envisioned was that which preceded the emergence of reality itself. That second circle, which represents birth, is the Septet, the beginning of time itself. That third circle, we can think of as a number of things. From one point of view, we can think of it as the unification of Kemet, the unification of Upper and Lower Kemet, because what that enabled was the emergence of the very advanced national civilization that would ensue from it. And then perhaps we could think about that fourth circle as being represented a confluence of periods of decline as well as periods of renewal. Perhaps the 12th dynasty and the Kemet ensued the repetition of the birth, perhaps the 25th dynasty and the Nubian redemption. The point is that the Chicago notion of time relates in many ways, both explicit and directly, to the Kemetic worldview, particularly in the sense that they believe that time was an orderly phenomenon, that time was an orderly procession, which is the basic idea of Maat. They didn't believe that time was a process that was absent human meaning. They maintained that in order for the passage of time to be embedded, to be suffused with meaning, suffused with lessons and significance as it relates to the journey of humans through space and time, that this idea of Ma'at must inform that process. They didn't refer to that as Ma'at, but this idea, this notion of Ma'at, as it relates to order, was inherent in their worldview. One of the things that I think is significant is that last circle, that fourth circle, which represents death and transformation. In many respects, I suspect that that is what we are, what the African world community is and has been for the last several centuries. We might think of the Ma'afa rather in that context, the Ma'afa being the interrelated processes of enslavement and colonialism, and the destructive role that they had in terms of the malformation of African life, the decimation of African social systems. But even within the midst of such destruction, there's always the capacity for rebirth and transformation. And so our journey through time continues. The responsive reading for today was one that I thought was particularly poignant, which is from the book of Ipuwer. And what I like about that text is that Ipuwer is looking out at the world and he's seeing a world that is characteristic of Isfet, maximal chaos and disorder. When I initially read that text, and I thought about the world that Ipuwer was describing, I thought about Emile Durkheim, the French sociologist, and this idea of anomie, but I was like, anomie is not what Ipuwer is talking about. He's talking about Isfet. And the reason that Isfet is most appropriate is because he's talking about a world where Ma'at is no longer the ascendant order of the day. Not that Ma'at is absent, because one might argue that Ma'at is always present, though perhaps less visible at times than others. But where Isfet is characteristic of the society in fact has been turned upside down. He talks about people who once were endowed with good fortune have now been dispossessed. People that once walked upright with dignity now, have been put in a subordinate position. And so Ipuwer is describing a world where the condition of Isfet has transformed the land in very radical ways. I like this idea. I like what the text represents because in many ways I think what Ipuwer is describing is the world that we live in, the world that I believe all of us have been born into. A world where Africans have been dispossessed of their culture, where Africans have been dispossessed of the social systems that are necessary in order for us to live full and meaningful lives. I was at a conference, the Sankofa Conference, in 2006. The Sankofa Conference is an annual conference in Washington, D.C., organized by the Akabiya Society. Nana Ajay Koto was speaking at one point in the conference, and he said, everything is broken, which I thought was very interesting. What he was talking specifically about another notion of time they have called historical spiral cycle, which I can't get into right now. But he was suggesting that because of the process of the Ma'afa, our social systems have been shattered, but we struggle to rebuild. And this is really, really important, because when we think about that fourth circle on the Decanka, even in the midst of things being broken, we attempt to rebuild. I mean, if you think about the period of enslavement in Haiti, in fact, if you read The Irritated Genie, or you read by Baba Jacob Brothers, or you read The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. One of the things that C.L.R. James does at the beginning of that book is he talks about the sheer brutality of the enterprise of enslavement and hate. I mean, it was absolutely brutal. But what's interesting about the period is that despite the sheer brutality, there was an undaunted and irrepressible belief by Africans in Haiti in their capacity to be free. And this belief in their capacity to be free ultimately informed their successful struggle for liberation. Even if we think about the end of the Civil War, immediately after the Civil War and the ensuing emancipation of Africans, you had this whole period where Africans are roaming the roads of the South and putting ads in the newspapers because they're trying to mend the systems that have been shattered. They were looking for lost loved ones. They were looking for the wives and the children and the brothers and the mothers and the aunts. And so even in the midst of destruction, we continue to build. So death is not finality, but death also provides the potential for transformation. And so when I.J. Cotto said that everything is broken, indeed everything is broken, but we're busy attempting to put things back together. So people were described the world, and one of the things that's important about this world, and Theophile Obenga talks about this in his book African Philosophy. He says that this is a quote, the Pharaoh in his capacity as guarantor of Maat was naturally the supreme lord of the country. He was responsible for the maintenance of universal harmony. If that harmony got ruptured, the entire country fell prey to terrible crises in the form of tremendous social upheavals and terrible psychological and economic and cultural troubles. Dr. Carruthers made a similar point, but a bit differently, when he said that the Nasute's overall function, like that of Wasir, is the establishment of Ma'at and Tawid, which is the united two lands of Kemet, Upper and Lower Kemet, to establish conditions where enlightenment will prevail over ignorance. The emphasis on the national government, I think, is appropriate given the social values of ancient Kemet. It captures the obligation of the ruler to adhere to the highest ethical standards possible, and in doing so, he instructs the nation in the way of Ma'at. However, while the Pharaoh's charge was to concretize Ma'at, meaning to solidify Ma'at, to create structures that gave expression to Ma'at in the national life of Kemet, this should in no way obscure the role of the masses of the populace, whose work would enable Ma'at to permeate the society. By aspiring to the ideals of Ma'at, the citizens of Kemet were expressing the values of the nation and emulating the principles that they believed governed the cosmos. Thus, the preeminence of Ma'at in classical antiquity poses an interesting challenge for those of us seeking to live this ideal in the present. This is complicated even more so given that we do not live in a society where Ma'at can be considered a cardinal social value. Quite the contrary. Like Upu, where we too might look about the societal landscape and see unrestrained manifestations of isfet, again, chaos and disorder. Yet rather than lamenting these circumstances, I maintain that this creates an opportunity to operationalize Ma'at. In fact, I contend that this is vitally necessary if we are concerned about both the restoration of order in the world as well as the liberation of African people. Dr. Carruthers said it best in Intellectual Warfare, where he said that, quote, in order to liberate ourselves, we must take the world and then reorganize it according to our worldview. Only then will mankind be allowed to live in harmony and with the universe. Only then will we truly be free. So if we think about this conception of time, that conception of time suggests that each moment in time is inscribed with meaning. It's inscribed with significance. Significance, particularly as it relates to our actions in the present, to live Ma'at and to make Ma'at an ascendant value in the world. But we're also in the midst of crisis. And the way that any value or any value system is expressed in crisis is a bit different from how that value or value system is expressed in a context of stability. One of the things that I think is particularly important in order to fully understand Ma'at and how Ma'at was conceptualized as holistically in ancient Kemet was to also think about the implications of Ma'at in terms of how people in Kemet saw humans, how they saw ordinary folks. When I was thinking about this, I looked at three texts. I looked at the book of Knowing the Creations of Ra. I looked at the instructions of Ptah-Hotep, and I looked at the instructions of Kagen. I'm not going to talk about all three of those because I don't think I have time to, but one of the things that struck me about the book of Knowing the Creations of Ra is that it provides a really rich example in terms of how people in Kemet how they understood the universe through the lens, through the paradigm of Ma'at, and and thus Ma'at became a value, not only that they saw in terms of the structure of the universe around them, but a value that they felt was indispensable in the lives of people. There's a section of the text which Maulana Karenga labels the 4 good deeds of the Creator. And the text illuminates 4 vital aspects of the world that enable people to live full and meaningful lives. There are 4 basic conditions. The first condition is, quote, the 4 winds, which in some respects is the atmosphere. The second condition is, quote, the great flood for irrigation, end quote, which is an allusion to the shared bounty of the nation's agriculture in ancient Kemet. The third is the making of, quote, every person like his or her fellow, end quote, which is the establishment of virtue as the nature of the human being. And the fourth was an inescapable awareness of, quote, the day of death, end quote, which refers to human mortality and how our awareness of this is a constant reminder of our obligations to the world. It's highly significant that these deeds, that the deeds in this text are situated in 2 domains. 2 of the deeds refer explicitly to the natural environment. 2 of the deeds refer explicitly to the social world. I think the emphasis on the natural environment is particularly important because one of the imperatives, one of the obligations of adhering to a life based on Ma'at in ancient Kemet, and also the implications of this today, is structuring our lives within the order of the natural world, instead of creating a society or attempting to prop up a society that attempts to exist outside of it. There's a lot that can be said about that. The second is as it relates to the social systems that are necessary in order for people to live full and meaningful lives. 2 of the things that are pretty apparent as it relates to that is the importance of the sharing of the bounty of nature, which is something that comes up as it relates to the deeds, the idea that everyone benefits from the agriculture, that everyone benefits from the benefits of the flood, the periodic flooding of the Nile River, not just the wealthy, but also the humble. And so the idea is that the riches of the world are something for all of us, which is not just a statement about the nature of the physical world, but it's also a statement about the type of systems that we have to create, the type of systems that they existed and the type of system that was consistent with this practice of Ma'at. But also, which is the 4th deed speaks to this, the 4th deed emphasizes that our obligations are not simply to ourselves, but those ideals and principles that have enabled us to be. This can be conceived of on several levels. First are our ancestral obligations to honor our ancestors in the anticipation that those who come after us will honor us when we have passed on, but also by venerating the highest ideals of Kemetic culture, which are represented in the forms of the Necharu, and that these Necharu were associated with particular localities, and that each of these things represents an attempt by the people of ancient Kemet to ascribe meaning to those spaces, to elevate the significance of those spaces, and to enshrine the practice of values and behaviors in those spaces that they believed were consistent with the advancement of the nation and the national interest. The didactic text of Kemet, which is the instructional text of Kemet, also offer a great deal of insight. One that struck me is in the instructions of Tawatep, when it says, this is in the first part of the text, where he says, cautious against being arrogant because of your knowledge. He says, because no one is born wise. He says that, don't be arrogant because of your knowledge, that the limits of art, Obega translates this a bit differently in his book than Karenga, I think in Maulana and the Husia, he says the limits of knowledge have never been reached and the skills of the artist have never perfected. Obega translates the text as the limits of art have never been reached and the skills of the artist have never been perfected. And he goes on to talk about how wisdom is rarer than fine jewels. We believe in emeralds. He refers to as greenstone. Yet they can be found among maids of the grindstone, bigoted as servants of the wheel. But the point is that the idea that knowledge is both infinite in its potential, yet none of us can achieve, can fully possess that infinite knowledge, is both a caution against arrogance, but also an incentive to aspire to attain our full potential, to acquire as much knowledge as we can. But at the same time, the text acknowledges that wisdom, though finite in quantity, can be found everywhere. So one way to think about that is that in Kemet there was this idea that knowledge, that wisdom rather, was diffused across the populace, that wisdom was not strictly within the purview of some of these social strata, but that wisdom was within the purview of all, and the significance of wisdom was its capacity to enrich the lives of everyone in society. And so, Ptahhotep's instructions as it relates to knowledge and wisdom is a direct example of Ma'at as it relates to how we internalize this practice of Ma'at, how we practice balance, how we practice order, and also justice, and the implication that this has in terms of how we live in the world. What each of these texts attempts to expound upon is the ways in which Ma'at serves as a concrete ideal in comedic life. Fully apprehending or fully understanding the nature of Ma'at is not simply an abstract idea or an abstract conception, but fundamental to understanding the application of Ma'at in the world. The practice of Ma'at, I argue, in fact, is more important now than ever. One of the things that the Dikenga offers is that when we think about these cycles of time, the cycle of decline, or the point of decline is also a point of renewal. And so we find ourselves in a situation, in a moment of that renewal, the moment of something that is dying but also transforming. And we are in fact birthing, we are in fact conceiving of a different world, a different type of world that hopefully will come to fruition. Therefore, in striving to overcome, this idea of thinking about Ma'at has profound implications for the basic challenge which is put before us. One of the most significant practical applications of Ma'at is the challenge of reclaiming African culture and restoring African sovereignty in the world. But also in doing that, as suggested by the Book of Knowing the Creations of Ra, not only are we attempting to reclaim our culture, restore African sovereignty in the world, but in fact, by doing that, by adhering to a rigorous practice of Ma'at, in fact, we are restoring the world itself. We are restoring balance to the world itself. We are restoring harmony to the world. This poses a basic challenge in conceptualizing how the practice of Ma'at leads incontrovertibly towards these goals. Dr. Brothers left us a potent challenge to take and reorganize the world. How does this process begin? How is it sustained? I maintain that this task requires for us to practice Ma'at on two levels, intrapersonally and socially. On an intrapersonal level, we must become fully cognizant of the intricate web of social and environmental relations in which we're embedded, and to marshal this understanding, to use this understanding in the service of focusing our will towards an ever-expanding social practice of Ma'at. Thus, through the practice of Ma'at, we seek to enhance our sense of self-imposed order, our sense of discipline, and understand the consequential nature of our actions. I maintain that these logically lead towards enhancing the social practice of Ma'at, which is the second level, wherein our enhanced awareness enables us to proceed more forthrightly, more deliberately, and more effectively towards the actualization of Ma'at in the world. I maintain that the social practice of Ma'at and Kema was inextricably linked to the major institutions of Kemetic society: the family, the schools, the state, the economy, and so forth. These were all institutions that expressed and reinforced the ideals of Ma'at. And I believe that our charge is that we institutionalize Ma'at in a similar fashion. Institutions are core structures of the maintenance of any society. Absent their institutions, Kemet, Aksum, Oyo, and any other African society that we stated today would have either never come into being or would have passed out of existence long before it reached its developmental apex. Institutions advance the society's imperative. This means that institutions seek to maximize the viability and capacity of any necessary social function: feeding ourselves, clothing ourselves, housing ourselves, healing ourselves, teaching ourselves, and so on. Institutions also seek to reproduce themselves, thus ensuring their survival. Hence, institutions are structured so that their mission endures long after the individuals that inhabit them, that started them, have passed on. Our task, I maintain, is to make Ma'at a fundamental part of everything that we do, which means integrating Ma'at within the framework of existing institutions where possible, creating institutions that are unambiguously committed to the unfettered expression of Ma'at in the world, and also by supporting those institutions that are engaged in the work of actualizing Ma'at, of concretizing Ma'at, and teaching about Ma'at, so that the transformative capacity of that work can gain expression in the world. Ma'at is both a call to work and a call to action. The practice of Ma'at requires comprehensive systems that reinforce and defend Ma'at. It is not simply a philosophical idea, nor is it an idea that is simply an ethical value, but it is a holistic paradigm, a totalizing social imperative, which means it affects everything, it informs everything. This means that when we escape the West's idea, this Western idea that spirituality is a compartmentalized practice, we then better position ourselves to truly understand and operationalize the African worldview. To practice Ma'at is to embrace struggle for a better world. Hotel.